Do you enjoy classic RPGs with meaningful choices, vast character customization, and engaging storytelling? You'll definitely want to try out Baldur's Gate 3, but there's also a bit of clunkiness that you need to learn to get through to really enjoy the game. And most fanatics who have played the game for hundreds of hours already will just assume that all of the things that they learned over time were easy to learn. But not everyone is expected to invest hundreds of hours into something to enjoy it. Because of how much quality and effort has gone into creating the world of Baldur's Gate 3, it's also a very complex game that you'll need to know the systems and how combat works, which is based on Dungeons & Dragons, which isn't the easiest to get into. And although having tons of options is great, it can be overwhelming at first to try to figure out what you're supposed to do. Luckily, Baldur's Gate 3 is not D&D, neither is it Baldur's Gate 2. You can get into it without any prior experience, so long as you learn the mechanics of this game. So the purpose of this video is to provide a full guide to getting into Baldur's Gate 3, including what settings will enhance your experience, the mechanics of the game, some useful tips, and what choices you may want to make when creating your character so that you don't need to spend as much time as I did learning the game. Of course, this will provide no spoilers or decisions you should make in the story, because the fun part of the game is discovering your own path without a pack of lone wolves hunting you down for playing the game differently from them. Now, before you even get into the game, there are some settings you may want to change. Choosing how you want to open the game from the launcher, there is DX11 and Vulkan. DX11 is going to be much more stable for older PCs, but if you have a new PC or you have some errors, you can try out Vulkan, which is what the game is meant to be played on. However, the specs required for this game are higher than most other games nowadays. Under gameplay options, you can enable karmic dice if you want, which normalizes dice rolls so that you can't lose too many in a row or potentially even win too many in a row. I personally don't suggest running this for multiple reasons. Many of the actions in Baldur's Gate 3 are decided by dice rolls, from the combat to dialogue to actions that require skill attributes to perform. Usually most dice rolls are from 1 to 20, that's a D20, but there's many other dice rolls that just represent the randomness of actions. So whenever you see something like 2d6, it means you're going to roll 2 6-sided dice. So the range of outcomes is from 2 to 12 on 2d6. And the range of outcomes on a 3d4 plus 2 is 5 to 14, because you'd be rolling 3 4-sided dice and then adding a 2 to the end result. Rolls can also decide whether you succeed in action or how much you succeed when you do. Oftentimes your dice roll needs to overcome a specific goal set by the difficulty of that action. So if you're trying to lockpick a very complex lock, the number you need to roll on the dice is much greater, simulating its difficulty through randomness. If you're trying to land a hit on an enemy, your odds of hitting have many factors, such as whether you are below or above the enemy, if there's good lighting for you to see, your skill with that weapon, the enemy's defense against your weapon, which is their armor class, and whether or not allies are nearby. You can also gain modifiers on your dice rolls from spells, your attributes, or situational circumstance. Having proficiency means you get bonuses to your dice roll. Having advantage means you get 2 dice rolls and you get the higher value of the 2, which will improve your average roll greatly. So before we get too lost in the numbers, enabling karmic dice will make the game somewhat easier because the randomness is more predictable. But I think not only will the game feel more rewarding if you don't play with karmic dice, it will also provide you a more varied experience. There are so many different outcomes to every dialogue interaction that if you enable karmic dice, you will generally have the same interactions every time. But with unbalanced or normal dice, where you have tons of high rolls or low rolls in a row, there will be a much more varied experience, especially in repeat playthroughs. To experience some of the more niche but interesting situations, you will need to get a high roll on the dice multiple times in a row to progress the dialogue or skill checks. But as with any of the suggestions in this video, you decide what's best for you. Don't let anyone else force you to play the way that they want you to. For most players who just want to see all the options or progress the game towards their desired result, they can ignore most of the randomness by just quick saving the game before they get to a decision, and then quick load if it doesn't go their way. You can find the keybinds for quick save and load in the keybinds. Usually they're F5 and F8. Of course, this can ruin the meaning of your decisions if you're trying to immerse yourself in the RPG elements, so decide how often you want to save the game. If you're one of those people who hate save scumming, then luckily there is still a way to influence the dice rolls that really matter to you with the inspiration system. You can re-roll the dice once per inspiration you have, which you can earn inspiration by doing actions that meet your character's backgrounds, which you can find in their character sheets. For example, soldiers are inspired by taking on combat challenges, but others like Sage may be inspired by intriguing magical events, or Urchin by picking pockets. So the more you stay to your character's roleplay, the more you can choose what you want to do. But if you give up on that and just want to see everything, then use saving and loading liberally. Naturally, your character is the most important thing in the game. Who you play as affects everything you do. You can make a completely custom character and take your time going through the extensive character creation options, choosing your background, which will give you proficiencies in specific skills, like the Acolyte, who will roll better on religion skill checks, or an Urchin, who will roll better on sleight of hand skill checks. Or you can make an origin character, which is a pre-made character with their own story built into them naturally. You can find these origin characters throughout your playthrough and see their stories even if you make a custom character. So don't be afraid to make a custom character because you'll miss out on their stories. You'll still be able to adventure with these origin characters and visit them in your campsite to learn their stories or even invite them into your party. You can also become a character with a dark urge, which is a combination of a custom character and origin. You create your character, but then they'll have a pre-scripted story that plays out sort of like an origin character does, but a little bit more open-ended. Essentially, the dark urge just wants you to kill everything, and you have to either resist the urge for violence, or just let loose and kill everything while finding out what the cause of this urge is. This is a good option for players who just want to experience the combat, which is arguably one of the more engaging parts of the game. People who play like this are often called murder hobos because their story devolves into having no ties to anyone and most interactions end instantly with choosing to fight instead of seeing the branching paths of dialogue options. With Baldur's Gate 3, there are so many different outcomes that simplifying it like this can ruin the experience, at least in my opinion. But the Dark Urge origin will add extra story to what the cause of this urge is to make up for this, so it's definitely something worth trying later on. Character creation might take you a while depending on how much you want to explore the customizations. Most of these options are just purely preference. However, there are some that will affect most actions you take, mostly the race and class you choose. The stats you get can be changed, but there are some unique features to each race that really can't be quantified. For example, elves and drow have immunity to sleep, which is a powerful spell that incapacitates something until it's been disturbed or attacked. Dwarves, gnomes, and halflings have the ability to fit in smaller spaces.
What? I cannot jump the distance you have to touch me!
All races have their own unique dialogue options, but there isn't an optimal race for each class. Check out the sub-races of each and decide which you will think works best with your intended playstyle. Elves might appear to be the best class on paper, but if they don't fit your playstyle, they could be worse. So at the end of the day, it's choice. But here are some interesting race and sub-race benefits that you can consider. Wood Elves have the highest movement speed, so they're great for melee classes like rogues that want to get in and out of range of enemies rather than just stay in the battle. Or they could be used for rangers that want to keep distance from enemies while shooting arrows. Then High Elves get a cantrip for free. And don't worry, we'll go over the difference between a cantrip and a spell later, but a free cantrip can be pretty nice because it's a basic but reliable damage source. It can be good for casters like wizards or sorcerers that need to choose which cantrips they use so they can have more options that they can pick from. It could also work with a battle mage playstyle for paladins who want some extra ranged options for spell casting. Tieflings are like the devils, and the Zerial and Asmodeus tieflings can enhance their intimidation and performance ability, so they can be great options for bards, since performance is a skill for how well you use musical instruments. And either tieflings or dragonborn are great for their fire resistance, especially in groups with sorcerers in them, because of fire. If you just want to swing a sword, then Githyanki are proficient with them. They can also jump further and have a mage hand which they can summon to surround your enemy if the rest of your party is ranged. This is because an enemy becomes threatened when multiple of your allies are nearby. It will make it harder for them to hit you, so it can help you support yourself on the front lines of battle, as well as other things. Githyanki will probably be the best fighters and barbarians because of how much mobility and weapon prowess they have. If you're not into swords but prefer axes or hammers, then dwarves are the way since they're proficient in them. But if you're playing a class like fighter that already has proficiency in these weapons, it isn't going to stack, so this isn't really a big deal. Dwarves are also naturally durable with immunity to poison and have low movement speed, so they're good options for frontline tanks. Now if you're thinking dwarves are bad options because they have low movement speed, remember that the classes can change things entirely. If you're a dwarven druid, you can shapeshift into an animal that has entirely different movement speed. Or if you're a Githyanki paladin but don't have a good sword, you can always summon your own. Be creative, but most importantly, do what sounds fun for you, not what sounds optimal. Drow and deep gnomes have superior dark vision, which lets them see really far into the darkness, and the most dangerous places are sometimes the darkest places. Seeing further in the dark can improve the accuracy of ranged attacks greatly. Lightfoot halflings and deep gnomes are better at sneaking, which is good for any class. But all halflings have the lucky trait, which makes them able to re-roll anytime they get a 1 on a 20 dice roll. This is really important because when you roll a 1, it not only means that your value is low, but it means no modifiers can be applied. You just fail always. This is called a critical miss, and likewise, rolling a 20 would result in a critical hit, which always lands. No matter how good you are at something, a critical miss or a 1 roll will always fail. Avoiding critically missing can be really good for improving your consistency, especially when you have access to many modifiers to your stats. Now you can still roll a 1 2 times in a row as a halfling, but that would be extremely rare. If you're ever unsure about what any of the keywords in game mean, just press the inspect keybind, which allows you to freeze the screen and hover over the tooltip and get another tooltip about that keyword, which you can then inspect again as many times as you need to and as deep down the rabbit hole as you want to go. It can get complex, and some of the keywords might not make any sense at first, but because most of the game is very visual, you can still just learn what things do by testing them out. Remember that you will have a party with several characters, so you don't need to do everything on your main character. You'll have the ability to diversify your composition and have one character with a high wisdom stat and therefore high perception handle detecting traps, and another character with high charisma handle persuasion. Or just don't worry about any of that and just kill your way through every situation. What really matters is what class you choose and the main abilities of each class. There are 6 main abilities that all characters have that can affect many things like dialogue options or environmental challenges, but they're mostly used for combat. While you want all of these stats, some will have a higher priority for your character depending on your class and build. Strength increases the chance to hit and damage of melee weapons like hammers and axes, but also increases how much you can carry, which is great for the character that you pick up items with. It also increases your ability to jump across gaps or up ledges, and your ability to shove enemies which is extremely powerful for controlling positioning. However, strength can only increase melee playstyles. Dexterity, on the other hand, increases the chance to hit and damage of ranged weapons like bows and some melee weapons like daggers and short swords. But it can also help you to remain undetected in stealth, increase your armor class, which is your ability to avoid being hit, and gives you more initiative, which means you'll take your turn in combat sooner. Constitution gives you more hit points, which is useful for everyone because you can't do much while dead. If you have to constantly keep giving a hand to your teammate who gets knocked down, you're losing efficiency on your other characters. Enemies also use the amount of health you have as one of the factors of which target they choose. And if your squishy mage keeps getting focused, you either need to have them way in the back, have someone support them, or you need to give them some constitution. Many skills will also require concentration to keep them going, and being hit while concentrating can break your concentration and stop that effect. However, you have a chance to keep it going, and this uses your constitution stat as the modifier. So characters with higher constitution can get much more value out of these concentration effects. Intelligence improves spellcasting, usually for wizards, and your ability to recognize or investigate the world as you explore it, which can help you solve puzzles or interact with magical objects. Characters with higher intelligence are like the ones you've studied a lot, which doesn't necessarily make them smart in practical situations. Wisdom is the more street smart attribute. Like intelligence, it can increase some spells for clerics, druids, and rangers, but it also increases your ability to handle more practical situations like diagnosing illnesses, recognizing danger, or communicating with animals. Charisma increases spellcasting for bards, sorcerers, and warlocks, and can help you to interact with other characters in dialogue, such as persuading them, creating lies, or getting them to like you. Because many situations revolve around talking to people, and getting a resolution or preventing conflict can get you what you want much easier, this can be a powerful stat for players who enjoy more of the roleplay aspects of dialogue. And because your main character will often be doing all the talking, having your main character as one of the classes that use charisma can feel pretty good. Not only do abilities help you to succeed when performing many actions, but they help you to prevent harmful effects from succeeding on you. These are called saving throws. So when you're taking the initiative, it's an ability check, and when you're reacting, it's a saving throw. They happen at the same time, but who uses which depends on who is initiating the action. That's something you'll often see in the tooltips of specific spells, but it's either just offense is an ability check, or defense is a saving throw. So if you're about to be tripped by someone, it may use their strength as an ability check, and your dexterity as the difficulty class, or saving throw for how hard it is for them to trip you. And then they need to roll higher than that, including any modifiers to successfully trip you. Likewise, if an enemy is putting an illusion on you, it'll take your intelligence stat as the difficulty that the illusion actually fools you. Most of this happens automatically, but this can still be important when choosing which one of your characters takes the lead. For example, if you need to push down a door, use your high strength characters like fighters and barbarians. If you need to talk to someone who doesn't trust you, use your high charisma bards or warlocks. Some classes don't benefit from specific abilities, but every character can benefit from all abilities because while your fighter may not use intelligence, they become more susceptible to spells if they don't. And while your rogue doesn't necessarily need strength, it can still benefit from strength for the ability to leap or shove enemies, which all classes can do. Not every class is immediately obvious which their main attribute is, but you can see their main ability with the star above it when making your character. However, there might be some extra stats important to your class, such as Ranger who wants to improve their pet control, or a Rogue who wants to become an arcane trickster. They both want dexterity still, but the Ranger could use wisdom and the Rogue intelligence as well. There are also builds that would prefer to use an ability that isn't your class's main ability, but you can figure those out and experiment as you learn the classes. You can change your build options later on. They aren't 100% set in stone. There will be many different situations to overcome, and having a diverse party with classes using different main stat abilities will mean you can handle most of them. But that's up to you to decide. You could have 4 rogues and never fully engage in fights, or you could go with a balanced party with a warlock, fighter, cleric, and druid. Diversifying your composition also means your characters all won't be competing over the same loot. They could share it. Here's a quick class picking guide to help you decide what class you might want to play or to complement who you have in your composition. Generally, there are 4 roles you can play. There's a caster, which can do range damage that hits multiple enemies with spells. There's your tanks, who get in front and lure enemies to attack them instead of your allies while trying to survive. Then there's the strikers, who deal consistent damage to single targets using weapons in melee or at range with bows. And then there's the supports, who heal and buff allies. Not all classes fit neatly into these roles, like a Circle of the Moon Druid, which can shapeshift into a bear to tank, and then into a wolf to buff allies in one encounter. Or you could be a ranger that focuses on avoidance to attract enemies in melee range to attack them, and miss for a tank playstyle. And a bard, which is normally a support, can even specialize in swords for a striker playstyle. For your first playthrough, I don't suggest going for multi-classing or extremely one-sided compositions, but in subsequent playthroughs, you'll be able to experiment. However, I'll suggest a couple compositions for starters to show the decision making of building a team. We'll start out by putting a cleric in the team because they're just an extremely powerful support that uses the wisdom attribute and has access to the guidance cantrip, which is extremely useful for dice rolls all throughout the game. Then a warlock, which is an easy to play but powerful caster that uses charisma, so they can do all the talking, but also the warlock summons can be useful for solving environmental situations. Then a rogue that uses daggers and dexterity to do burst damage to key targets and pick locks. And lastly, a fighter which can wield a two-handed weapon with the strength ability so they can handle jumping, shoving, and throwing heavy objects. Now that composition is pretty simple because it's basically your stereotypical D&D party, but let's look at a similar comp using different pieces. We can use a bard that supports in combat using charisma, which also makes them great for doing the talking. And since bards become a jack of all trades, they can also be used to pick locks. Then we don't need a rogue and can get a ranger to take all the dexterity weapons, but still provide the same role of a striker from range. Then a paladin can provide the role of a tank while using strength and even a bit of wisdom. And then we can round it out with a caster wizard that uses intellect. And since wizards can use any spell from a scroll, they can often bring great utility in the absence of a cleric. So start with a class that sounds like something you'd want as your main character, and then build a composition that complements or fills in roles that they don't fill or doesn't want to use the same loot that you do. This is going to be a huge decision, so if you're unsure what you want to do, then you're in the same boat as the rest of us. But at some point you just need to stop overthinking it, click venture forth, and start playing the game. The most important thing in Baldur's Gate 3 is controlling the game's camera, because exploration and combat in this game can often depend on whether you see something or not. You'll want to get the most vision possible, and there are many options for this. I go into my keybinds and set the forward, back, left, and right camera movement to my WASD keys, and then camera rotation as Q and E, which makes it more convenient for me as an MMO player. You can also control your camera with your mouse by holding the middle mouse button and moving it left and right to rotate your camera, and then drag it to the top or the bottom of the screen to move it forwards or backwards, and scroll the mouse wheel to zoom in or out, which means you could play the game with only a mouse. When you're trying to look ahead of where you're at, you'll want to move your camera around independently from your party, but sometimes you don't want that, or you lose track of where your character is. You can lock your camera to your character by clicking this little button on the minimap, or what I have as the home keybind. This allows you to walk around casually when you're just enjoying the scenery, and then swap back to independent camera control when you want to get more strategic. Holding your left mouse button down also will keep your character running in that direction instead of having to constantly click the ground. Sometimes you'll forget where your character is, or the camera will get bugged in a wall. Just toggling between the characters by clicking on their portraits or pressing the F1, 2, 3, and 4 keys that correspond to each character will usually fix this. There's also a tactical camera option, which just turns the camera above the battlefield from a bird's eye view to make it easier to see around the terrain. But since the terrain matters a lot, you'll usually want to toggle this on only some of the time. Audio and video options are going to vary on your preferences mostly. The game looks great, but it's massive and can be really laggy, which ruins the immersion. But you can optimize your performance for your PC, first of all, by updating your graphics drivers. Then you want to try turning down any of the options with shadows or clouds, and turning off subsurface scattering. These are great for taking screenshots with, but don't do too much besides adding a little bit of depth. VSync can be turned off if you're having issues with frame drops, but otherwise it will keep the audio synced with the video. Turn off post-processing and bloom if you don't care too much about the lighting. If you're still laggy, start turning down your texture and model quality, but those are the last things you should turn down if you want the game to look good. Baldur's Gate 3 is about working together with multiple characters, and things can get complicated even before you get into combat. It matters who does the action, because if you pick up an item with a specific character, it's in their inventory, and you can't freely use items in other characters' inventories while in combat. Who you do things with is important, but who you don't do things with is also important. You can group together specific party members by dragging their portraits together, or separate them from groupings by dragging them until the chain breaks. This can allow you to send your tank in first without the rest of your party standing in the danger zone around them. You can quickly group and ungroup all party members with the default keybind, G, and from there you can also use the F1 through F4 keybinds to quickly select specific party members. This makes it much less tedious to set up each party member in the right spot before an encounter, and you can get a positioning advantage at the start. Stealth is an important part of the game even if you aren't playing a character designed around sneaking, because it can allow you to avoid fights or get into a better position to start them, and enemies who are surprised by you lose their initiative. You can use the default keybind C or click the icon in your main action bar to make the character you are currently controlling sneak. When one character is sneaking, they won't follow others unless they're also sneaking. So in many situations, you want your entire party to sneak, and it can be tedious manually entering and exiting sneak mode on all of your party members. So what you'll want to do is click the icon below your party window, or the default keybind Shift plus C will make your entire highlighted group go into sneak mode. Remember, your party can be linked or unlinked too. Now we're finally ready to go over the combat, which is turn-based. Characters who have higher dexterity or initiative go first, and every character gets to do 3 different things per turn. There's an action, which is usually swinging weapons, casting spells, or other things like interacting with a gate lever. Bonus actions can be supportive or utility spells, movements like jumping or shoving, or offhand attacks. And then you can move a certain amount, which depends on the race or class you've chosen. This can seem a bit formulaic at first, but every character, regardless of their class, has some options to spend your action points on. You can use dash to increase your movement for that turn, which is great for repositioning, but it means you can't attack, so there's a trade-off. Or you can prevent enemies from hitting you when moving through them with disengage. Basically, when you try to move through enemies, they can trigger an attack of opportunity shown by the red arrow when hovering over your path. So when enemies get right next to you, it's not possible to just run away, they'll get a hit off for free. To avoid this, you need to decide to use up your action point to disengage, or you need to push them away from you or somehow incapacitate them to prevent them from reacting to your movement. Otherwise, you need to stand still right in front of them and ranged abilities have much lower chance to hit targets that are right in front of you. So this is why positioning is important, and having a tank get up in the face of the enemy ranged characters, or to prevent enemy characters from getting into the face of your ranged characters, is key to the tactical combat of Baldur's Gate 3. This is really hard when enemies can just dash right by you and ignore your tank. So one option is to have a sturdy front line to keep the attention of enemies, but another option is to position your backline on high ground where enemies can't easily reach them. Being on high ground also gives you better chance to hit with ranged skills, and even further, light sources affect chance to hit. Characters who are in darkness are harder to hit, and characters next to light sources are easier to hit. You don't need to do all the math on this because it's sort of intuitive, and the chance to hit is displayed when hovering your attack over the target. Bonus actions can also be used to jump over terrain, which also requires some of your movement, and depending on the positioning, can move you further than you normally would. But then you don't have your bonus action, which you could use to push your enemy with shove, and depending on where you're standing, this can help your party member escape or put your enemy in a bad spot. Mistakes still happen regardless, and sometimes your party member will be put into the down state when their health reaches 0. They're not fully dead, and you don't need to use a revive scroll yet. They can still be helped up by your ally. You can use their action point to use the help up, but it's not the best use of your action point, and you need to be in melee range to do that anyways, though you can do it infinitely. What's better though is to use a healing spell, which you can do from range, which will get them out of the down state and heal them, so they're not going to instantly go into the down state again because help only gives them 1 health. You can also throw a potion at them, which will revive them, but remember that you have limited amounts of potions, so try not to be too reckless in combat. Besides these basic actions that everyone can do, there are specific action types. There are cantrips, which are basic spells that many classes can share, but generally they're not that strong. The benefit of cantrips is that they don't cost spell slots, so they can be used infinitely, so long as you have an action point required to use them. In longer fights, conserving your spell slots and using cantrips is key to not running out of steam. For spells that use spell slots, there are different levels of spells. Certain classes gain a class mechanic which uses its own resource, but then there are level 1, 2, 3, and so on spells. The higher level spells cost more but are more powerful, and you'll often have less spell slots available for them. You can always upgrade a level 1 spell to use level 2 spell slots, but you can't downgrade a level 2 spell, for example, to use level 1 spell slots. You can sometimes get more healing or more damage from spells by leveling them up, like if your healing spell is a level 1 spell, but you ran out of level 1 spell slots and you still have a level 2 spell slot available. But some spells will have no extra effect for upgrading them, so you get more value from using that spell at its appropriate level. Between these spells, some of them will also require you to concentrate. This essentially means that an effect persists over time, whether it gives a buff to your stats, allows you to travel faster, or gives access to another spell during its time. But if you get hit, you have a chance to lose concentration if your Constitution saving throw doesn't succeed. Another reason you want to keep your casters protected by your frontline. If they're getting attacked constantly, then their powerful concentration spells are getting cancelled, and they'll need to keep recasting them, which will cost more spell slots. Keep them protected, and they can buff your tanks and strikers to be even more powerful. Also, you can't keep 2 concentration spells active at the same time. This means that certain spells will compete with each other for resources. Some really good buffs are concentrations, but if you want to use something like Cloud of Daggers, which is a great space controlling damage spell that also requires concentration, then you need to choose between them. So when deciding which spells and cantrips you want to use, you'll need to consider which ones use concentration and which ones use spell slots, because even though this level 2 spell is really good, it uses level 2 spell slots which you want to use for another better spell. Or you want to use this cantrip, but it requires concentration, and that will interrupt the more powerful concentration of a spell that also uses spell slots. It can be a bit confusing with access to all of these spells, so I like to organize my hotbar with all of the global actions that I rarely use, like disengage and improvise weapon, far to the right, because then I can hide them with the sliders, and then I can clearly show all of my skills at the same time. Also, some of these global actions have keybinds, like jump is Z and hide is C, and if you get used to using those keybinds, you don't need to see their skill icon on your hotbar, so just move them over. After you get out of combat, some of your skills will refresh, and some won't. Some require a short rest or a long rest to recharge. Short rests recover your hit points and some skills, but won't recover your spell slots. You can do this twice for each long rest. Long rests will recover both of your short rests and all of your spell and hit points. But you need camp supplies to make a long rest. You can pick these up by looting food or anything considered a supply. Search for camp supplies in the search bar of your inventory to find all items that fit within this category. You can more easily see these objects throughout the world by using the expand tooltips keybind, which is usually by holding the left alt. Just toggling this for a short time whenever you go into a room will help you make sure you don't miss any supplies, or even more importantly, quest items. Now when you pick things up, they go to the inventory of that character and you can freely exchange items out of combat. You want to send the camp supplies to camp by right clicking them because they can clutter your inventory and you'll usually only need them to make a long rest anyway, and you can just access those supplies from the traveler's chest at your camp. So this can free up a lot of space in your inventory. You can also send items to camp that might not be useful for any of your current party members right now, but potentially later they could be. It can be a bit overwhelming to constantly handle your inventory, but organizing your consumables like potions and scrolls can often make them much more accessible and therefore will promote you to actually use them. Personally, I like to save my consumables for far too long, but just remember that you'll be looting as you adventure too, so don't save your consumables for Act 4. The last thing we'll go over is character sheets. Pressing I opens your character's inventory, but if you press Tab or click the party view icon, you open all your character's inventories. Give the items that are relevant to each character, but try not to keep all consumables on one character. If your character with all the resurrection scrolls dies, you'll be in trouble, but it's sometimes tedious to keep your inventory clean all the time. There's also more interesting information about your character in here. In the spell book, you can exchange your active or prepared spells on classes like Wizard or Cleric that can't have all of their spells prepared at the same time. Generally, spells that can only be used out of combat can be swapped in for the brief moment you need them, but then swapped back out for combat spells. The Reactions tab is where you can manage the settings of spells that trigger when it isn't your turn. These reactions can be when you parry an attack or gain an automatic buff. Turning reactions off might be a good idea for some spells because they can use up your spell slots automatically when you'd rather use them on something else. But turning reactions automatically on is sometimes the only way to get some skills to work, or to reduce the amount of downtime you spent choosing your actions. Then there's the character sheet. This tells you a lot of information you'll want to know that is just hard to remember exactly, so you want to refer to this often. Here you can find which characters have the highest stat, so you can decide who is the best to perform an action which needs that ability check. Like if you need to pick a lock, you want to see whoever has the best sleight of hand, which is underneath dexterity. Then you can find out your gear proficiencies. Hovering over the armor icon, you can see which armor types your character is proficient in. Wearing armors that your character isn't proficient in will cause you to have disadvantages in battle. So if you only have light armor proficiency, don't wear medium or heavy armor. You also need to be proficient with shields to use them properly. You can learn to become proficient with armors or shields through feats, which you can earn every few levels. AC stands for armor class, and the higher your armor class, the harder it is for enemies to hit you. This means armor gives you avoidance, not damage reduction. Although avoidance is in a way damage reduction, it's better than that, because if you avoid getting hit by something entirely, you also avoid the effects that accompany the damage. The next proficiency is for weapons. Simple weapons are usually available to everyone, but the more powerful martial weapons like greatswords or heavy crossbows will need to be learned through your class, race, or feats. But not only do you want proficiency in the weapons you use, you need the right stat modifiers. Basically, you want to know whether your weapon uses strength or dexterity, so you aren't using a weapon that you don't have the stats for. All ranged weapons use dexterity, like crossbows and longbows. All melee weapons use strength, but some melee weapons will use your dexterity stat if that's higher. These weapons have the finesse tag in their tooltip. Usually finesse weapons include daggers or short swords, and you have the option to still use these with strength, but mostly you'll have better options if you're statted for strength anyway. If you're a striker using melee weapons, put your best weapon in your main hand since there are some offhand penalties to damage. Versatile weapons can be used as one in each hand or using both hands to get a better grip. Generally, it's better to use both hands as a strength character because dual wielding uses up your bonus action, and strength characters can use that bonus action to shove, which has a better effect with higher strength anyways. But dexterity characters will definitely enjoy dual wielding their weapons. Resistances are mostly important to know for your enemies. You can right click and examine them to see what they're resistant to. This means that they take half damage from that type, but if they're vulnerable, they take double damage from that type. Immunity means take absolutely no damage from that source. You can avoid using damage that enemies are resistant to, or you can manipulate those resistances, for example by casting rain, which will make your enemies wet, and then they become vulnerable to lightning damage. There are so many fun and interesting interactions like this, but it would be impossible to go over everything there is to Baldur's Gate 3 in this one video. But this should be enough to help you get into the game so that you can explore and experiment for yourself, because that's what's fun about it. So if you found this video helpful, share it to others, give the video a like, and subscribe for more Baldur's Gate 3 content. And I'll see you next time.